always, it's
You're more than
nice to
welcome.
see you.
Take care.
Melanie, if you want to stay, you're totally your wish.
Right.
I mean, Melanie is.
Thank you.
So, Andrea, you know the drill. It's about you telling us
I
about
do.
the symposium, you telling us about yourself, you talking about the topic. I am sitting here, Melanie is sitting here, we are listening to you. Get us in when you want us to come in, please.
Okay, so my name is Andrea O'Neill, as everybody can see from Vikram's thing, and I'm from Ireland. I'm a mediator. I work a lot with families, and sometimes I work with organisations. I work with anybody who wants to take part in mediation. So anywhere I feel I can use mediation, I will. It's something, as Vikram knows, that I'm very passionate about, and it's also something I feel that we do from our heart. So it comes from something more than knowledge and skills and everything else. Now, we do need those things, but I do think the core of it comes from the heart and the soul. And we've had loads of conversations about that beforehand. And I suppose for me, on this topic, it was very interesting, Vikram, because when you reached out to me first to do this, I suppose I had some sort of reaction to it. I wasn't comfortable talking about it. I kind of felt, coming from a country with Ireland's history, I didn't necessarily think I was the person that had the necessary knowledge to talk on this topic. I felt that there was other people that probably had more knowledge than I had and would probably contribute more to it. And working kind of, I was actually out walking with the dog, as you know, and I was thinking about this, and I was kind of going, why am I so reluctant to have a conversation about colonialization and mediation? And what is it that makes me kind of back away from it? And as I was walking and thinking about it, I'm very conscious of, so Ireland is split into two different regions. Like, we're on the one island, but we have 6 counties which are in Northern Ireland, and then 26 counties which are the Republic of Ireland. And so I'm very conscious of us being a small island, and I suppose the deep feelings that go along with kind of our history and everything about that. So I was worried about saying something that might offend somebody in some way or might trigger somebody in some way. And then when I went deeper into that, I was going, what is this all about? What is this resistance I have about speaking about this topic? And the more I thought about it was trauma that had been, passed down from generation to generation. It wasn't something that I necessarily experienced firsthand, but it was stuff that had been passed down from, my grandparents' generation to my parents' generation and down to this generation. And so as a result, with the learnings I had, without actually even realizing they were unconscious learnings, I was uncomfortable talking about this topic. So I was going, actually, that is the very topic we need to speak about, is the intergenerational trauma that might not necessarily be recognized, but actually affects who we are in everyday life as a result of colonialization or our country's history. So I was going, yeah, that's it. I'll text Vikram as I'm walking the dog and say, no, actually, I will do this before I change my mind. So hence I said, yeah, we'd have a chat about this conversation. So I have a couple of slides. Now, they're only simple, Vikram. It's just to give people an idea.
Because I think Melanie was talking about emotional intelligence, and I was telling her about this intergenerational trauma and how it affects people and how it affects people's attitude, of course, in general, but in relation to mediation and dispute resolution and disputes itself. So good. Andrea is going to cover all that.
Okay. Well, as much as I can, I'm going to base this based on, I think for me to be, speak from a place of expertise, if that's the word on this, what I can talk to is my own experience and the reflection I've done on it, as opposed to somebody else's experience. Because depending on where you live in this country, your experience will be different, and depending on everything else. So I talked from my experience, if that's okay.
But you're not going to share your screen right now. I'm going to take two minutes, not even 2 minutes, 30 seconds, just to say that mediatorvikram.com. You'll find details about this symposium and other events. And Andrea definitely has not gone there. So Andrea, at some point in your life, please go there and watch the other events, all the other shows and events, that all the details are here. Please read about the World Mediation Circle. One day, Andrea, you'll have to go to this website. So
I have been to it now, Vikram.
I don't know. But main thing is all the schedule is here. The other events also, the schedule is there. Just have a look at it. All the YouTube links are there. And of course, below that, there'll be the YouTube channel and all the various shows and everything. I won't get people into that. I don't want to take time away from Andrea. So just put it out there.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you, Vikram. Okay, so I'll share the screen just to follow my own thoughts, and also just to give a few kind of definitions. Okay, so we're going to look at colonialization, intergenerational trauma, and mediation. So what is colonialization? I just kept this very, very brief. The act of taking control of an area or a country that's not our own, especially using force and sending people from your own country to live there. Now, what was interesting about this, even getting the definition of it, I grew up with even though no matter what the history book said, with the belief that we're not a colony. Do you know what I mean? We are our own, that sense of ownership. Now, this is my experience, that sense of ownership was never given over. Not that it's ever given over by a colony, but just that's the thing. So when I, looked into this and asked other people different questions, do you consider that Ireland was a colony? And some people will say no, and some people will say yes, which I found very interesting. And even when you do the research on it, like, we're 700 years of history, but it's people's belief system. It's what they decided to believe or not believe. And that, I suppose, is based on a sense of identity and everything else. But it was so interesting to delve into this. And I mean, it's a topic I didn't want to touch. And I only had a conversation with somebody this morning about it too. So even the meaning of what it is, and by that definition, we were a colony, so, and, that's the fact if we're going by definition. But did people feel like that? Or did they, what way did they see it? So it's interesting when you look at a definition and when you look at a sense of how people viewed it from their perspectives. So just a brief history in Ireland, because the history is so vast. Ireland is regarded as England's first colony. We lived as part of the British Empire for 700 years. To go into that history, you're talking about, we went through the time of the famine. We went through, this is a huge year in Irish history, because it's 2022. So it's a year of, there's been a decade of centenary. So in 2016, we had the centenary of what was the Easter Rising, or known as the Easter Rising. This is 2022. So we had the centenary of our independence for the Republic of Ireland. So there was an agreement signed. Anybody can go in and Google all this history. It's fascinating. But just today, I'm just giving an overview of it so that we can talk about the trauma piece. So Ireland was first conquered by the Normans in 1169. And we did a short period of independence in 1640, but it really was a short period. And other than that, we were under English rule up until 1922. And that's when 1922 is what saw the divide between, the island of Ireland. So the 6 counties, which are referred to as Northern Ireland, and the 26 counties, which are known as the Republic of Ireland. Now, you can go into that history further and look at the Good Friday Agreement, where, the government is a combined government up there, and, there's different things going on. So people that are interested in the history of Ireland, it is fascinating. Mediation played a huge part in peace in Ireland. So really do go and do the research on it. You'll enjoy it. But what I'm looking at today, I'm looking at the perspective of trauma and the role that it has played in intergenerational trauma, and how trauma has been passed down from one generation to the other. So I suppose, first of all, what is intergenerational trauma? Well, intergenerational trauma is trauma that we pass on to the next generation. And we might necessarily do it through actions or words. Sometimes we can do it through a sense of silence. Sometimes we can do it by the way that we parent. Sometimes we can do it by the way that we connect as a community. Because you have community trauma, you have, it just breaks down. If you were speaking about emotions, Vikram, on one of the symposiums or one of the conversations of the symposium, you'll know that emotions are contagious, and when somebody is feeling a certain thing, we pick up on that emotion and we feel that emotion. And similarly with trauma, if trauma has left a sense of emotions or loss or grief or anger in one generation, it's very easy when they're retelling things of the past that emotion is passed on to us, and that we live within the realms of that trauma, and sometimes without actually even realizing it. So I suppose for me to talk to that, like, I would have had stories. My grandparents grew up in the inner city of Dublin, and there would have been, the Easter Rising would have happened at the GPO, and they told stories of that, not only that they might have experienced as very young children, but what their parents experienced. And so that was the narrative you were being told. That was the narrative you heard. You heard about, how people were treated. You heard about, losses of life. You heard about, so straight away you're feeling, oh my God, that was so terrible. And these are such bad people. And, so that's, and you're living that trauma, you're living that fear again. And that fear is instilled in you. And without actually even realizing it, or that sense of you were robbed in some way, and that people are not to be trusted. That certain types of people are not to be trusted. And then, of course, we have collective trauma. So the intergeneration trauma is a collective thing, because when we're, it's been passed down maybe in our schools. It might be passed down in our churches. It might be passed down. So, for example, at one point in Irish history, we weren't allowed practice. So Ireland would have been predominantly known as a Catholic country. So we weren't allowed to practice our religion. So religion took place, it was hidden. So what your religion was hidden. So what happened then was, and we also lost our language. So our language was, I suppose, and even notice the wording I'm using, our language was robbed from us or taken from us. And so what we did, we had to find our identity. So what was being taken from us? Our religion was taken from us. And that nearly made people gravitate more towards it, because that became part of our identity. Being a Catholic became part of our identity, of who we were, because that was something that had been taken away from us. So we gravitated more towards that because it became part of our identity. The loss of your language. And what I know, even say from my generation in Ireland, there will be some Gaeilgeoirs who are people that speak Irish all the time, but very few of the population. And there's a sense then when you're away traveling, and the one thing that somebody would say to you, oh, are you English? And a lot of Irish people would take that as, no, I'm not. I'm Irish. We're different. We're not belong to that. And that's when a lot of Irish people would say, God, I wish I had my own language. I wish we still had our own language. And our language is part of our constitution. It's taught in our schools. There has definitely been a revival of it, but it is part of who you are as a people and identity. And when that's taken away from you, and a lot of times through force, well, that brings with it a certain level of trauma. Now, I wouldn't have been alive when that happened, as regards, obviously, because we're talking about hundreds of years ago where our language was taken from us. But still, that sense of loss still stays with me. That sense of loss of the language, that sense of sometimes shame that I'm not fluent in my own native language. And it's interesting, like it's, you would have children who go to Irish schools who would speak fluent Irish, but they mightn't necessarily use it when they're out and about with their friends. So language becomes something else that feels might have been taken from you. So there's that sense of loss again, and that reaching for identity. And when we are, I suppose, when we feel a disconnect from what our identity is, we search for something else to cling to. and I think that search continues and that trying to get back to it. Now, look, we have a very strong cultural roots around, certain things like we've our Gaelic football, we have our hurling, camogie, we've, Irish dancing, we've still so much of our culture left, but a lot of it had to be fought for to keep. And I suppose that's what we carry with us. Now, I'm only talking about my experience. If you'd somebody sitting here who'd lived through the Troubles in Northern Ireland, their experience is so much more traumatic than anything I would ever have experienced. I mean, they've looked at massive loss of life. They've had that sense of, where somebody would reach out to help. I mean, there's the story of a dying soldier and a woman reaching out to help the dying soldier and then, being murdered as a consequences of it. And that's trauma her family has to carry on, and it's sent on to the next generation, that sense of unfairness. And it's like, how do we heal this? How do we stop it? And how are we passing it on to our children? And sometimes maybe not even realizing that it's being passed on. And how do we accept our history and our past, and then, I suppose, break down that or move away from them and us to being just people, just human beings that sometimes got it wrong in history. And now we're trying to find a better way. And not everybody will find that better way. And not everybody, some politicians will, the best intention in the world, still kind of bring us down the wrong path. But the fact is that we never stop trying to make that difference. So how do we pass on the trauma? So a bit like I said, it's a repeating sharing of details of trauma to young people, to our children. And it mightn't necessarily be that they are in the center of the conversation, but if you have maybe adults sitting around the dinner table debating something that happened and talking about what it was like and the losses and what they were robbed of, and the stories maybe that their parents or grandparents told them. And we're sitting around the table and we're talking about it, even, a very innocent conversation. If you've young, especially children that are going through developmental stages, listening to this, they're going to be impacted by it. Because actually, when we listen to trauma, we actually experience that trauma. We can experience that trauma ourselves. And it can stay as a traumatic experience within our own subconscious, even though we might have never been part of it, or we were never there in real time. Another way trauma can be sent on, I met two wonderful ladies when I was on holidays a number of years ago, and they were much older than I was, and they had lived in Northern Ireland all their life. And we got into conversation one night, and we were talking about, how things had changed, how politics had changed, how they were talking about how it felt much safer and everything seemed at a much better level than it was, but there was still undercurrents of stuff going on. And I asked them, what did your children think when you told them the stories? And they said, oh, we don't speak about it. It's never spoken about. And so that's how they dealt with their trauma. It was locked away. They didn't speak about it. But then when you talk to them about parenting, their children had strict guidelines about where they were allowed to go, where they weren't to go. There was this protective parenting where they were kept close. They were kept within certain communities. They were only allowed to integrate with certain people. And it was because of their sense of fear and trying to protect their children from what they had experienced without actually saying what they had experienced. So even in our silence, we can pass on trauma by how we behave and by what we do. So it can be unconscious and nonverbal. So even in our facial expressions, our bodily gestures, it's like if somebody was telling a story and, it's just our reaction to a story. Like if you were telling me something that happened, say in India, you'd have a fair idea how I was feeling about that story by looking at my body language. Like it's like if we watch something frightening, we might recoil a bit, or something we disagree with, we might go, oh, I don't want to talk about this, or, so we send out messages without actually verbally communicating it. And this is felt, it's this sense of passing on the emotions. And what has happened is the emotions or trauma doesn't have a timeline. So it doesn't know that this happened 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 30 years ago. It just knows that it's getting this information now. So this is the real time. It's not, it doesn't register that this was a long time ago. So this is just a little, sugar, sorry. Just move this. Sorry, I'm just going to move a little bit over. So this is just kind of a breakdown of how we can pass on intergenerational trauma. So we begin at the beginning, say we're born into the world, everything's happy and safe, we're living among our family, and we're starting to kind of, maybe learn about certain things. We'll pick up on maybe our parents' stereotypes, maybe some of their biases. And like we're very, especially at a young age, we believe that these people are telling us everything is true. Everything they tell us is true. We have no reason to doubt them. We've no reason to question their biases or their stereotypes or anything else. So a lot of the time, we will just believe what we're told or believe what's taught to us. And that's what we're supposed to do, because they're our caretakers. They're the people that are looking after us and that are minding us. And a lot of what they're passing on, they probably experience from their parents. So then we go into maybe the school system, or say into kind of our churches and things like that. And then these ideas are reinforced. So the stories are reinforced, the history books reinforce it. And sometimes it mightn't necessarily reinforce it to its totality. There might be information missing. So we might be just be given one side of the story, or, maybe one perception of kind of everything that was happening. And again, this leads on then, a lot of this information we're taking in at a young age is all unconscious. So we don't even realize that information is in the back of our mind. And then something happens and it triggers that information to connect to something else that we're experiencing. And that trigger may cause us to react in a certain way. So it might be that there's a sense of anger. We might, get over angry at somebody because of maybe, their country's history, not necessarily because of who they are, but based on where they're from. We might have built up a stereotype of, this is what those people are like. This is what our history has told us, and not actually look at it as, this is an individual. So we react from a place of, this is what I've learned. This is a stereotype that we've built up based on our experience. And that stereotype I'm using to, I suppose, direct my decisions and direct my reactions when I'm triggered in some way. So an interesting part of this is also the self-hatred. So I was saying to you earlier on, sometimes I would often feel maybe guilty that I'm not fluent in my own native language. And that sense of, that I have let my cultural identity down by not making more of an effort to know my language or my own language. And I'm not sure that most of the people feel like that. I'm just talking from my experience. And then if you're talking about somewhere, that has experienced the violence, so if you take, say, Northern Ireland and something, just say on a Saturday night, there's two groups of youths out partying and something happens. And they may react to that, not based on what's happening in that moment, but based on the history of information that they're subconsciously carrying with themselves. That they react in that way, that feeling, that anger, that everything else that comes from, hundreds of years of oppression and hundreds of years of violence and hundreds of years of, feeling robbed of certain things. And that might be actually what's displaying itself in that anger, and not necessarily just what's happening in that moment. So how do we change this, or how do we move this? And this, I suppose, is where mediation comes in. So there's, as I said at the start of it, like mediation has been such a huge part of peace in Ireland. And I mean, a lot of other countries who would look at, I mean, you know, what former Yugoslavia, and, you know, they would look to Ireland as in what we did and try and use that as a framework for moving forward. Because we used mediation, not only just from, you know, political top level intervention, but also within the communities. So especially within the 6 counties, like there were women, especially women up there, that joined together from 2 sides of the Troubles. So that actually connected together and worked to create a better future for their children, who actually came into the room, who spoke together, who set up community programs, who set up, you know, peacekeeping organizations in order to address that trauma. We have the Glen Cree Centre, which is based in Wicklow, which is absolutely, it's also known as the Garden of Ireland, Wicklow. And they used that centre during that time to actually bring different communities together to address the trauma, to talk about the hurt, to acknowledge the hurt and the harm, and to help people move on, and to try and prevent in some way of that passing on of generational trauma, to actually address it. So by addressing it within the person that's experiencing now in this moment, well, then there's less likelihood of that trauma being passed forward. Now, if that trauma is, you could be the 2nd or 3rd generation and you still experience that trauma unknown to yourself, it is when you start doing that work and doing that reflection and having a look at it, and by understanding it yourself, we can be more careful about how we are around the next generation and what we pass on to the next generation. So even little things as children growing up, like there were nursery rhymes, you know, that really, you know, you didn't think you were learning anything. There were nursery rhymes that you innocently sang, you played out on the street with. I mean, if you were to analyze them now, they were totally inappropriate, and they were stories that were being passed on from one generation to the next. But they were passed on in a way so that you understood the hurt, you understood your history, but it also left you with the trauma, you know, it left you with that feeling of hurt. And you know, some people will never realize that that's inside them. I mean, when you contacted me originally, I had to really figure out what was it about this that was triggering me. Why did I not want to talk about colonization? And I mean, I did say felt that a lot of people would have more understanding, more expertise, and more knowledge than I would have. But I actually had experienced this trauma without actually realizing it. And so unless you kind of reflect and you're put in this situation, would you even realize it's there? You know, another area that my family like would have experienced, say, the trauma of this was during World War II. My great uncles would have, so Ireland was really poverty stricken at that stage. And so my uncles would have gone, my uncle and my grandfather would have gone to fight in World War II. So they would have gone as part of the British Army in some way. Now, when they went, there would have been considered as taking the Queen's shilling. So there would have been a sense of, for certain members of the population, that they had betrayed their country in some way by going to do that. For them as fathers, they were doing that mainly from a place of economic, that they needed to feed their family. It was guaranteed income. It was a job. But what happened was a lot of those men went over and experienced the trauma of war. But when they came back to Ireland, it wasn't spoken about because they felt ashamed, because there was a sense of shame attached by going to fight in the war because they had sided with what was considered the enemy in some way. And so they brought that trauma back with them and they never spoke about it. And they never passed it on because of the shame they felt for doing it. And really, it's so sad when you think back of it, because you think they were trying to feed their family. They were trying to find the best way forward. And I mean, I'm sure there's men that went and did it because they felt it was the right thing to do as well. But there was, you know, people were looked down on for actually doing it at the time. And now that has been recognized, and it has been recognized that, you know, these men need to be remembered. And the trauma they would have brought back to their family. So can you imagine coming back from, you know, something like that and not being able to speak about it, not being able to discuss it with your family, not being able to discuss it with your children? That has to go somewhere inside you, and that has to affect you as a person in how you operate. So how does that change you as a parent? How does that change you as a spouse? How does that change you as a sibling? How does that change you in other ways? And what does that change due to the generation or the people that are around you? So when it's all kind of bottled up like that, so that's what this did. It wasn't even just up until 1922. It was when we went to World War II and people went to fight, there was a consideration that, you know, actually you shouldn't be doing this, you know, and the saying was that they took the Queen's shilling, you know, which is, you know, it's sad in a lot of ways. And then those men carried that trauma of being in a war, and also the trauma of not being able to share with their family or get the help they needed or have the conversations they needed to have. And that's passed down onto the next generation. So even though we're looking back 100 years now since 1922, and we'd be considered post-colonial, there's still an element of it that carried on. And I really think it's something, this is actually such a great conversation, Vikram, even though it was something that I kind of didn't necessarily want to have, because even for me as an individual, even if nobody else has an interest in what I'm talking about today or the effect it has, it made me go back and reflect and think about my family and think about my grandparents and think about my uncles, think about the divide it caused in the family in, you know, 1922, like we had, you know, with the War of Independence, you know, when the initial kind of proposal was put forward that we would split the island into 6 counties and 26 counties. And that divided families for generations. And so that has become a legacy. And what we need to do is actually look at that and address it. And it has been addressed in so many ways through mediation, through the work in Glencree, through the work in Northern Ireland with community mediators on a higher level. Women in mediation in this country have played a massive role in bringing peace. And, you know, actually there's an exhibition on in Belfast at the moment, and it's called Her Story as opposed to History, because they feel that for a lot of what happened and about bringing peace to this island, that the women were instrumental, but they were only remembered as a footnote and not necessarily celebrated. So there's actually an exhibition on at the moment where it's called Her Story, and it's celebrating the role women played in bringing peace and using mediation as part of that next step to colonialization. But I do think you have to remember, if you're a colony for hundreds of years, that trauma is not going to go away overnight. It's something that we have to work on from generation to generation. There's actually research done. I wonder, do I have it here? Sorry, Vikram, let's see, do I have it? Oh yeah, here it is. So, sorry. Oh, there it is. Sorry, Vikram, I thought I lost it there for a second. So research with second-generation Holocaust survivors with post-traumatic stress disorder found them to have lower cortisol levels than the control group, right? Similar research demonstrated a relationship between high levels of stress and the gene which codes serotonin. Now, this is new research, like fairly recent in the last 20 years. So, you know, there's still a lot of work to do around this. So this new research offers a new perspective of intergenerational trauma, that of a genetic entity being transferred from generation to generation. It's still in its infancy, but it is something that's being researched even further. So we are actually, if this is true, if this research is found to be correct and true, and there's more research being done on it, as humans, we're evolving to adapt to that trauma that we're passing on. And that just absolutely fascinates me. Sorry, no.
There's an interesting noise I'm hearing.
Yeah, I don't know what that is. Sorry about that. Oh,
There was something that you left out. Yeah, you left this out.
so we talked about the land. So in Ireland, one of the things is that we have a great sense of ownership over our land. We all like to own our own houses. We all like to own land. Like there's a movie called The Field. You should watch it to give you an idea a bit around the importance of land in Irish culture. And I do think a certain amount of that comes from land being taken away from us. There's a place in Ireland called Valentia Island, and it's just off the coast of Kerry. And when that was taken over by the British, all the good lands were taken for, the English that came in, and the Irish were moved down to the poorer land to work the poorer land. And then they became tenants. So they were taken off their lands and they became tenants. They had to pay a rent. They had to provide food. And it even changed the food we ate, because suddenly we were producing foods for mass export. I mean, hence then we had the potato crop and the famine that brought about that. And I mean, I think 4 million people at the time, there was 8 million in Ireland at that time, and about 4 million left in famine ships to just try and survive. I mean, obviously not everybody made it. It was a terrible, sad time in Irish history. And then our laws, a lot of our laws would be based on British law. So a lot of them that we would have kept and just, nearly twigged, so a lot of our laws will be based similarly. Religion, so that pull towards religion. And I do think it's, maybe it wouldn't be as noticeable now, because people have rebelled against, I suppose, the Catholic religion in the country and the church and everything else. So that's not an issue now, but I'm talking about initially that was part of what we identified to. When our religion was taken from us or it was banned, there was a sense of, no, we're going to fight for this. This is part of who we are. And the loss of power. So when you feel powerless as a person, you search for that power in other ways. And, maybe one of the things that we carry on as trauma is that feeling of untrust of somebody who tries to exert power in any way, or seems to, in our perception, to be looking to control us in some way. And autonomy, like we all know why autonomy is important. We need to be able to make our own decisions and feel we can self-determine our own futures. And when that's taken away from a nation, it is traumatic. And again, the effect on our culture and how it has changed and shaped our culture. Now, it's important to remember there's a lot of great things that we've taken on with some of the most beautiful universities because of colonialism. Like we have some beautiful buildings that have been left behind. But really what today I'm trying to talk about is the trauma that's passed on from generation to generation in my, I suppose, by looking at my story of it. So my grandparents, my parents, my great aunties, my great uncles, and how I know those stories, and I carry that stories, and I feel it when I talk about, my grandparents, what they experienced from their parents. I can feel that fear they felt when they were, outside the GPO in 1916. Like, how is that even possible that I can feel their fear? So we relate to it, we connect to it. When I think of my great uncle or my grandfather carrying that shame and trauma because they were trying to support a family, and that really saddens me. Like, I feel sad that they had to suffer in that way. I feel sad that it was seen as a betrayal on their part and not seen for another part of it. So I do think having these conversations, opening these discussions, talking about things that are real and that we experience really can help us move on from that trauma and not pass it on to the next generation, and not pass on that feeling of having to be at war with somebody. Instead, that feeling that, we're a collaboration as a race, as as a world, we are all connected together, and everything we do has either a negative or positive impact on those around us. And we have to be conscious of that. But sometimes, if it's in our subconscious, we might necessarily understand it. And a bit like our biases, until we bring it to our conscious mind, we can't actually deal with that trauma. So this was a real learning experience for me on a personal level, Vikram. So I don't know whether that makes much sense to anybody else, but you've given me a great opportunity to reflect on how it has, I suppose, sculpted the way I think about things, or the way I've had to resculpt things to change the sculpting that was put there. So if we consider ourselves to be at the potter's wheel when we're, bringing up the next generation, or even influence on the next generation, it actually, it determines how they look and how they feel at the end of the day. And really, sometimes we have to break that up a little bit and maybe put it back together again as something more beautiful to move on from it. But I do think we have to break it down and break it up and look at it. So that's where I am with this. So it's been a great exploration for me, Vikram.
It's been a great presentation, Andrea. Your things that you brought in are things which are very relevant, very important to discuss. But I still feel that you did not discuss the famine as much as I thought you would. That intergenerational trauma, which according to me affected the aspect that you're talking about, these people going in the Second World War, that was not too long after the famine. And famine was, the way the British went about it, what they did to Ireland at that time. I think all those things were connected. Look at today, we're sitting in 2022. That was what, 1850, 1860, what they'd what they'd seen there.
Yeah, but Vikram, what's fascinating about that is that, people are now re-looking at that, and they're not happy that it's called, they want to change the wording of our history. So our history tells us it's a famine. And there's been loads of documentaries done, and they're saying this was a genocide. People were starved out of their homes. People, like, there was grain being sent to all different parts of the world while people here on this island were starving. I mean, the history is shocking when you go back into it.
Yeah, that's exactly.
And what those people had to experience. And I mean, they had to watch their children die. They had to bury their children. They sometimes had to decide which child was going to live and which child was going to die. They had to become very individualistic about survival, because they had to they couldn't worry about the survival of the whole community. They just had to worry about the survival of their family, and then even went back further into their own survival. So I suppose, really, for me, even as I'm talking about that, Vikram, I can feel kind of something bubbling inside of me, because I think of those people, I connect with those people. They are my ancestors. They are the people that I connected to. They are the people who suffered, and we're left with nothing. And actually, I suppose the most part that kind of really upsets me the most is that actually there was no need for it. That actually there's something could have been done, right? They might have been able to stop the plight as regards kind of the plight in the crops of potatoes, but they certainly could have helped those people survive. They could have, provided the food that was there when there was shiploads of food going out. I mean, really what happened was people they got on ships. They died on those ships. There's actually a lovely inn on the Docklands there's a memorial to, the people that we lost during the famine, and you look at them and you go, oh my God. And for some of us, like, I remember as a child learning about it in my history books, and it was kind of history, and this is what happened, but you didn't connect to it maybe straight away, because you were still connecting with the more recent history that was going on. And it's only when you look beyond the recent history you go, my God, there was generations of trauma before that. There was, the famine, or, that sense that we were starved, that we were unimportant, we weren't considered to be of a same class or, a same race. And it's the same in, genocides all over the world where this happens. But Vikram, you will have people that will come and say, that actually wasn't a genocide. That was a famine. That was a thing, so it can't even be agreed on what it was. If you ask an Irish person what it was, they would say, yeah, it was a genocide. If you maybe ask somebody from somewhere else, from Britain or somewhere, they might say, no, it wasn't. It was a famine. Or they mightn't even know about it because it wasn't part of their history, because it was seen to be separate. It was part of the Irish history, and it wasn't recognised as being a problem that was caused by the way the political system worked. So there is a lot about that. And probably there's things I'm only touching on, Vikram, because I feel I have that's such a huge sense of connection towards them. So it's very personal. And I think anybody that comes from that type of history or comes from, a country that had been colonized at some stage can feel and connect to those things because they were their parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-great-grandparents. They were their ancestors that actually dealt with these. It's like, when you go into First Nations, and I remember speaking to a mediator who was First Nations, and he said to me, what do you do when you go into a mediation? And I could have probably told you this story before. And I said to him, I always ask, talk to, like, my dad has passed and my grandparents have passed. And I'd always say to them, help me do the best I can by these people, by these people I'm going in to work with. And he said, that is exactly what we do. We call on our ancestors, but we don't just go to the generation beforehand. We go right back and we call on all our ancestors to come in and help us in the mediation room. And I suppose that's what it feels like when I talk about these things. You nearly feel like they're in the room with you. And you feel a sense that, what I'm saying good enough? Is what I'm saying correct? Am I expressing how that trauma was sent on? So I suppose it nearly feels like too big of a responsibility to actually talk about in case in some way you don't do justice by the generations that have gone beforehand. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes total sense. And I'm saying that this is such an important aspect because obviously so many countries were colonized, and this mindset, this trauma is affecting a lot of people. And I think it is something which is going to, of course, connect to mediation, definitely, dispute resolution, definitely, disputes themselves majorly. So I think we need to talk about it because, I mean, like I say, you said the famine or genocide, whatever it is, affected things after that so much. I mean, just the fact that, like you said, your population, I mean, I think you must be the only country in the world where your population today, if you compare it to what it was before the famine, I think you're about the same. You haven't in terms of population.
We halved our population. Like we halved our population. We were 8 million in population.
Today you've reached about that level. I don't know how much you're at today. So that's what I'm saying. That you must be the only country in the world. Yeah, so you're the only country in the world where your population today is what it was 1850s. I mean, before 1850. Yeah. So all that, so much has happened. I mean, people moving out of the country, how they then, wherever they went, what they went through there, all those things. I mean, I'm sure there's so much that connects everything.
And it does. And it's even that sense of having to have ownership to land. Like if, like there's an Irish saying, here, if somebody starts dating somebody and they live out the countryside, have they road frontage? In other words, have they got planning permission for their land? Can you drive in? Can you build a house? So there's this sense of importance about having land and owning land. And I really think that comes from, because if you look at the rest of Europe, that, there isn't, now it is changing here, but there isn't the same need to actually own and purchase land and a home, because people are happy to rent. They might rent in accommodations. But here in Ireland, to own land is huge. To farm the land is huge. And I can't help but feel that comes from a place of land being taken off us, a place of that our crops were grown to feed different nations and not to feed ourselves. But I am also conscious of, that when we have these conversations, that the conversations are about addressing the trauma that's left behind and moving away from the trauma and not igniting the anger. So I think that was one of the fears, that as mediators, we don't want to reignite anger, but we want to look at what's underneath that anger. And what's underneath that anger is, traumatized. People were traumatized. And it's looking at that trauma and working with that trauma and helping people move on for it. Because, one thing we do know is we can't change history. No matter what we do, we can't change history. But what we can do is look at the effects history has had on us as a culture and as a nation, and see what we can learn from that history. But by learning from that history and moving on from our history, we also have to address the harm and the hurt that was done. And there's been a massive amount of work done in this country around that. Both from Britain and from Ireland working together to try and reduce open up dialogues, have conversations. But I think really it's focused mainly on, say, Northern Ireland, where a lot of the troubles were. And they definitely, in recent times, was where they experienced most of the trauma. But what maybe is forgotten about is the other trauma that the rest of the population carried with them, without necessarily knowing it, without recognizing it as trauma. Because remember, as we talked about intergenerational trauma, it's not necessarily passed on through words. It's passed on through nursery rhymes that we tell our children, rebel songs that might have been sung when, kids were younger. It's passed on by our attachments. So, how we attach to our children could have been affected by how we were attached to and how our grandparents were attached to. And that could have all been affected by trauma that generations beforehand felt, and how we parent our children. So we mightn't actually even really recognize that we were traumatized by our history. Like if you had to ask me 6 weeks ago before the symposium started, were you traumatized by, the history of Ireland? I'd say, no, I wasn't. I'd say to you point blankly, no, I'm very forward looking, very positive, very, I look towards what's ahead of us. And it was only when you kind of reached out and said, really talking this, I was going, what is the block? What is stopping me from having this conversation with Vikram? I'm used to having conversations with you, Vikram. I'm used to sitting in your, in your space and having a chat with you. And like all we're short of is a cup of tea or a cup of coffee. But what I actually realized is some of these things are triggering me. So why are they triggering me? And that's where we came up with the intergenerational trauma. And that's what it was. So how many people of our populations across the globe who've been, I suppose their history is colonization, how many people are traumatized and might never realize it? Because these won't be in this space of mediation where we're trauma aware, where we're reflecting, we're having these discussions, And I suppose, again, the other thing was for me was that fear of inciting anger in somebody in some way by something I might say. And that's why I was very careful to actually do it from my experience, because I don't want to, in some way, I suppose, undervalue somebody else's trauma or undervalue, or make my trauma to be something bigger than somebody else's. Because as I said, if you'd asked me 6 weeks ago, I would have said there was no trauma there. But when I look back, and I go through it and we look at what trauma is and we look at how it molds us into the people we are, I would say, yeah, definitely history has passed on trauma and we carry that trauma with us. But I think the important thing is that we address those traumas. We have those conversations. We speak about them openly without meaning to, I suppose, cause any hurt or disrespect to anybody else. But those traumas need to be acknowledged. And only then, I think, can we move on from them, because they are the lessons. I think it's recognizing the hurt, the damage, the trauma that's caused to generations by war from, that deep personal level. That's where war gains nothing comes from. That's where we've nothing to gain from war, when we look at the damages that are being caused. Because, now look, and then you look at Ukraine and you look what they're going through at the moment. And the trauma that's going to be left there is going to be massive, massive. They've lost complete control of their homes, their country, and their workplace, their families. They can't even, for some grandparents, they might, the younger generation might have, taken a flight to somewhere safer in a different part of Europe. They don't know when they're going to see them again. That is so traumatic. There's actually an ad at the moment, like an advertisement on TV, and there's a documentary that's coming up about Ukrainian families in Ireland, refugees that are in Ireland. And one of the shots is two young children talking to their grandmother in Ukraine. And they're trying to tell their grandmother how much they love her. And then one of the children, who's only about 4 or 5, says, "When can we see you?" And she goes, "I don't know, when the war stops." Now, those young children coming now from Ukraine who are suffering that, who are living that trauma, feeling that trauma, we have to be so careful. We have to be really gentle. We have a responsibility to mind those people and help them deal with the trauma that's coming down the line. At the moment, it's about survival. It's about getting a roof over the head. It's about getting to a safe place. It's about keeping as many people alive as they possibly can. But after that, there's going to be trauma. There's going to be intergenerational trauma. But this is where we have the opportunity to step in and to actually help. And that's where mediation will come in, is to actually address these issues, allow that space to talk about trauma in the real time. Because remember, we were saying that when we talk about traumatic situations, it has no timeline. So when they're telling their children in 10 years or 15 years' time, their children won't know it's 15 years ago. Their memory, their unconscious memory, will remember that as traumatic now. And that's how we'll remember it. Where if we help people deal with the trauma when they're ready, not now, it's, there's too much else going on. But we have a responsibility to help with that trauma. So as little as possible is passed on to the next generation so that we can learn from our history and move forward. So that's
I think this is a very important thing that Andrea has to take to the world. Intergenerational trauma because of colonization. Let's keep it to colonization. Of course, the wars and everything obviously affected. Let's take this forward, because emotions, attitude, relationships, everything then is connected in some way. And this aspect of genetic thing that you were talking about, they've done this experiment on rats, where one rat was given something to eat and it loved that thing. And then after that, they started giving electric shocks when they touched that thing. And that particular thing went into into the brain at that time. And then finally, for 7 generations, the rats were staying away from that, whatever that thing was. It takes that much time. It just goes on. So I think this is something which we need to have more discussions on this, because definitely it makes a difference when you're sitting with people and to understand them. Are you looking at this aspect at all? Are you even considering this aspect about someone? Is someone else in those relationships even considering those things?
So I had a mediation a while ago. And it was, without going into too much details, but the two people involved came from different backgrounds. One would have been, from the Republic of Ireland, one would have been Northern Ireland. And that definitely had an impact on how they were in conflict. That definitely had an impact on how they negotiated. That definitely had an impact on how they understood each other. And it's not until you go deeper with each of them individually that you actually figure out what that is. And so then you're mediating from a place of understanding. So when you understand where somebody is coming from or what trauma they're carrying with them, you can help them move forward. And it's nearly like as if you hold them with that trauma to help them move forward. Because, we can't rid them of trauma straight away, or we can't do that. There's a lot of work that has to be done with that. But if we're in a mediation room and we come across trauma, we have to hold that safe space. And sometimes it might mean not even having a conversation, not asking questions. Maybe they're not able for the questions. Maybe they don't have the words. Like this part of the brain, the language part of the brain that we lose when we go through a traumatic experience. And we mightn't necessarily have the words to express the trauma that we have experienced. And we have to just, as mediators, we just have to hold that space so that they feel safe, that they feel that their trauma we're nearly cupping the trauma in our hands and holding the weight of the trauma for them so they can go through the process. And I think sometimes that's as much as we can do as mediators. It is to be aware of the trauma and to know how to address the trauma when it comes into the room. And sometimes I think if that trauma is too much, is that we know that we need to link up with somebody else, that maybe, we don't have the skill set to actually deal with that trauma, that maybe they need some support to help them with that trauma before they can mediate, or until they can come into the mediation room. So I think that's what's important for us, that we recognize it. But I think, again, like most things in mediation, we have to recognize those things in ourselves. And so, say for me now, doing this little exploration over the last number of weeks, what I've learned is that I do actually have carried, now we're talking about based on colonialization, like I've, a little bit, I've carried some intergenerational trauma with me. But that trauma then has seeped out into my family. So say, for my mother, so it would have been her father that would have been away in World War II. He was based over in Italy. And for him, when he came back as a parent, he found it really difficult to function. So he was an alcoholic. So that affected how her experience of him and the rest of her siblings or everything else. As a result, when she was bringing us up, it wasn't that she was against alcohol. She had an absolute fear of anything around alcohol, like terrified of alcohol, really, caused a fear. And she wouldn't necessarily see that as intergenerational trauma. Like she'd say, oh, that's because my parent was a drinker. But why was he a drinker? What was his trauma? So what pain was that numbing out? And that goes back to his experience in the war. So his experience in the war, and also how he was perceived by other people when he came back. And that goes back to colonialization. So it's amazing how we mightn't necessarily always link it, but sometimes if we go back far enough, we can find actually the root of it, and it can come back to there.
Absolutely. And there's so many things that what you spoke about, of course, the cultural identity, language. This is common to all those places where colonization happened. I mean, this is something that you will see, and that's affected things. The other thing about where all the influences, basics like nursery rhymes you're talking about, Ringa Ringa Roses, the content of that was not the best, and it was repeated for a long time. I mean, we grew up singing it. So those are the kind of things which, I mean, of course, now you have movies. I mean, of course, movies are influencing the mindset and what they are doing, programming it. Social media, definitely. But history books, I mean, I'm saying, who writes that history? I was talking about in some other session also, that the history that's given to you is what you read. How much of it is edited, how much has been left out? You have no idea. You think you're reading history, but is that the right way to go about it? I don't know. There's lots of, I think, things on that aspect that needs to be looked at. And that's again, finally looked at. This is now the decolonization aspect. That even when decolonization happened, even then, of course, people had their agenda. They stuck to that, so that then it became another form. It was, of course, different people, but it was another form of the same thing. So I'm saying we haven't moved away from colonization. So that's why I was wanting to discuss decolonization as a separate thing, and it being as not just colonization and mediation, but decolonization also. I don't think we really decolonize. I was just speaking to I was just speaking to Melanie before this, and I was telling her the same thing. We haven't decolonized. I mean, two things. I mean, one, I keep saying that the day I'll take you to court and I'll send you to jail. When these are not threats, First of all, I think there is some form of decolonization that's happened. On the other end, the indigenous peoples and the dispute resolution methods and consensus building and all that, when we understand, yes, that worked and can work, that's also when we would reach. And Andrea will tell me other indicators we'll have where the systems and institutions need to be dismantled. Like I was telling her, not tinkered with, dismantled, blank slate, and let's work from there.
But you see, I think, yeah, I do get what you're saying, and it does need to be brought back to a blank state and work from that. But I can't see that happening. Realistically, I can't see that happening. So I think the best we can do in the work that we do is to help change the mindset. And we mightn't do it with everybody, but it's about planting that seed. It's about giving the supports to move forward. If we could dismantle it all, like there's a great article by I think he's Norwegian, Niels Christie is his name, and it's about that actually when we are victimized in some way, that when we go to court, that even our sense of being a victim is robbed from us, because we actually don't get the opportunity to say in our own words what our hurt was. And in that way, it's taken away from us, that the ownership of it is taken away from us. And the court is about what law was broken, what law wasn't broke, but it doesn't look at the harm that was done to the person. And I think a bit like that in what we're doing in peace talks all over the world and everything else, that there will be an element of, okay, this is what we need to do to move forward to peace. There will be mediation done. But unless you have those ground roots people working with individuals and their story and their narrative and the feeling of what happened, without working on those emotions and feelings of what happened, well, then it will never be ours. We will never take ownership of maybe the peace and everything else that has been agreed in documents and everything else. So I think on the political ground where that will be agreed, until we can feel that as individuals we have been heard, our stories have been heard, and even as collectively, but I mean on the ground up, as opposed to just on the political level. And I think that's where we come in, Vikram. I think that's where we come in as mediators doing the work that we do. And I think that is really important, because that's where the difference will come, is when you work with people and address their pain and hurt.
So look, first of all, Andrea, with me, there's no concept of any negative aspect of it. It will happen. We'll find a way. Like I keep saying, my bubble or my little world. In my little world, I'll do this, and then we'll keep expanding that world. That circle will keep becoming bigger. But that world mediation circle aspect, that's what it is. We create those little worlds all over. And in that little world, that colonial structure is not required. If that is the way, if you can take them through that. So it's not everyone becoming part of it, people who want to become part of it. And then when they experience it and then they talk about it to other people and they convert, they convert them onto this. That's how the move will happen, because definitely, like you're saying, those structures, why will anyone dismantle those structures? It's working for them. That the whole politics and ruling and all that, they're still happening. The same things happening. Why will they break it? So we'll have to create that little world, and those worlds will come together, and then let's see how it goes. I look at it from that. I don't even get negative about it, because my world is also a world, like I keep saying. In my world, I can do these things. So why not? Similarly, Andrea creates that little world around her where these aspects are looked at. And it's because one is the mediation aspect of it, doing a mediation and all that. But that's a very limited role for a person like you. You have a much larger role to play. And that's what I want to activate you into, maybe. Well, I'm sure you're doing it. I'm not saying you're not doing it. But I need you to work with me on this whole world mediation circle. How we start small, make it big. But I'm telling you that let's not get negative about it at all, at no point of time.
I know, I don't think it's negative. I think if we're real about what we can change. Now, I don't mean real. I don't believe in limitations. I think we have the possibility to change anything we want to change. But how quickly can we change it? And I think just to go back to, you know, kind of knock it all down, do I think that's going to happen? You know, can we just knock it down in a day and start again? I don't think so. I think we have to. So it's like if you're building a house and you have to put the scaffolding up outside it to support the structure so that it stays there for, you know, a very long time into the future. And I think that's what we have to do first. We have to make sure our scaffolding is up and then actually, you know, move forward. If I thought I could change it tomorrow, Vikram, I would.
No, I'll tell you how it's going to work. I mean, I'm saying it's so simple because this is all people. It's all people connecting to people. So what did I say? I said, my 1,000 connect to 1,000. That's all I kept saying. 1,000,000 people out there. Not difficult. I mean, okay, you've seen, we've got so many people who've been part of these shows and events. How much time has it been? If the first episode of Evolution of a Mediator on YouTube came up in January of last year. We've only in September of the next year, and we've got a lot of people there. And of course, I'm sure you find some of them all right as people, don't you? The good people.
I find them all right. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
So there must be how many? Maybe I don't know. I haven't counted, but there were 100 speakers in the first symposium. Then we've had this in conversation, the beautiful mind. We've had evolution of a mediator, the other symposia, conference. So definitely lots of people. So if that can happen in 1 year and some months, so just the fact of you connecting so many people, okay, I don't know, maybe 200 people. I don't know, I haven't counted. Maybe say 200 people. So if those 200 people are connecting to another 200, you've got 40,000 people out there who think on the same line, and they create a world around them. Look, these are people with the mediator mindset, and I'm saying peacemaker mindset. We just getting them together is okay. It takes work. I'm not saying it doesn't take work. Getting everyone, identifying people takes a little bit of work, but it's not something which was difficult. And what with my resources, me sitting and doing it alone, imagine that whole process just expands, and that you just reach out to more people, which is what I'm going to do after the symposium, working on that part of it. No, I don't find it difficult at all. And then when you reach that level, now you and your community are, of course, connected to at least 1,000 people, I'm sure. So once you reach that, like I said, 1,000,000 people, maybe let that happen, say 100,000. Now, those 100,000 people with the mediator mindset are connected to 1,000 people in their communities. How much does that make it? How much does it make it?
Don't know. You've lost me now.
So I know. I'm just saying, if you look at the numbers, you'll just think that connecting is not difficult. It's just that getting the right people connected to each other and wanting to create something. They have a similar vision to it. What is the vision? The vision is that collaborate. That's what the whole concept is. Sit together. Why do you want to go to that colonial structure? What has that? How does that help you? It's a threat. Okay, there's a threat to it, and that's why you go to it. So you remove that part of it. That's why make it a threat. You know yourself, you can't take it forward. You are going to be sitting together at some stage. So let's not touch the colonial structure. We are not dismantling it because it won't happen. You're correct. No one's going to let you dismantle it. But in that little world, they don't touch the colonial structure. You don't have to touch the colonial structure for everything. The police, that is one thing that it's a threat. That's what you bring them in. But if the community comes together and they can themselves look at these, so a lot of issues are not issues that need to go to the police, but they do. That's what the colonizer wanted. Bring me in. I have to be there. So we have to be able to create a community which believes that they can do it themselves. And there is a dispute-free village in India. Since independence, no case has been filed from that village. They've been able to manage it. Yeah, they've been able to manage it since independence, 75 years. So it's possible. It's just village by village, community by community. And I'm saying, when you create those model communities and model villages where this is happening, those people themselves are going to take it forward. People who would look at it like I just told you, there is this village. Now, if someone wants to understand, they can go there. Okay, how did they work? How did they go about it? And I'm not saying how, I want to get into how that village functions. I am saying we can create those spaces, not difficult. And it's not place-based. Doesn't have to be place-based. It can be various kinds of communities, which is what I put out in my the website that you haven't gone to, Andrea. there, there I put it all down. That's perfectly all right. I mean, this is my life. No one reads no one picks up the Zoom links. No one looks at my website. Perfectly all right. I'll still going on. But I'm just saying that you can create those communities around you and just tell yourself that we are not going to touch the colonial structure. And it's not difficult. It's not difficult. It's just that because one person knows they can do it, the other person thinks they will do it, and this whole thing gets escalated. And we today cannot dismantle it, but we can tell ourselves, for a moment, it doesn't exist. Look, I live in my bubble, which I told you. I don't know what's happening.
Yeah, no, I do get that. And I actually I do see that element of thinking that we create our own realities, and we are the architects of what we feel and what we experience, because to a certain extent we can choose how we react to things and how we feel about things. So I do understand that, and I do understand that way of thinking. So I think there's still that little bit of doubt in me that while you'll have people of the same mindset that will work tirelessly to get this, there will be other people that don't connect and don't want to be part of that circle and actually don't see it as important because somebody else is doing something already. Why would you reinvent the wheel? And yet it's not until it comes to their doorstep and they see the benefit of it and they see how it can help that they'll actually see the importance of it. So I think that's what it is, that it's all the time for us to get to that stage. And like what you're doing, Vikram, we're constantly promoting mediation. We're constantly promoting this thing of acceptance and connection and understanding and taking the time to actually listen to where somebody is coming from and to understand that their life experiences has had some impact on how they view the world. And everybody's life experience is different. So therefore, we all view it in a different way. So I think that's where we're heading, Vikram, is kind of to help people come into the room in dialogue, talk about their perceptions. And there was actually, I don't know where I read it today. Oh, actually, it was on LinkedIn. It was Cindy Noble put up a little article about research that was done. And when people were brought in, so it was to do with a film that they watched, and they were brought in to actually give their opinions on the film and what they thought about certain things. And after they had a discussion, they did other MRI scans on them, or they put them in the scanner to check out. And what they noticed was their brains were more aligned after dialogue. And I just think that's fascinating, And one of the things I said to Cindy is, I said, I'd love somebody to see the mediator's mind at the same time. Are we aligned with both? Where are we aligned? Where does our alignment come?
I think what you need to test at the same time is that maybe everyone's heartbeat is synchronized, and maybe breath is synchronized. But what was Ken was talking about one of his sessions about that aspect about the dating that they did. This whole concept of this was a test they did somewhere. They had
dating,
that dating concept, and whenever you had a nice conversation with someone, your heartbeat kind of synchronized, your breath synchronized. So there is, again, that's what I'm saying. There is so much happening there which we are not getting. Look, my discussions are out there. I want people to discuss that because there is so much more. But still, again, look, this for me, that's another colonization. The way mediation is being taken to people, that's another colonization. I look at it from that perspective. I'm fighting it out on this end, but it is still happening. So I know this happening because that's such a limited aspect of what is mediation. I think that people, as soon as they can, they should be able to do something about it. Because again, what did the colonizer do? That you are a savage. What you do is not civilized. I am bringing you something which is civilized. Same thing with mediation. Why did I have that discussion on indigenous peoples and mediation? That was civilized. People sat together. There was consensus building. That was civilized. Today, you are going out into communities, every part of the world, be it Africa, into a rural community there, and you are saying this is mediation, what you're taking to them. There are people being trained today. That is the industry. training, and people are being trained out there, which the word I don't like, trained there. They are taking this box, such a limited box of mediation, and they are now the mediators because they're certified. Imagine that there are people in that community who are mediators with the mindset, no training required, they have the skill. Today you've created a class distinction. That is not a mediator. This is a mediator. The colonizer stamp has been put on this person, so this is a mediator. That person is not. So you've created inferior people in their mind. It's a very serious thing, Andrea. I'm saying this to you. I'm telling you, this is so serious for me, the way it's going about. I think that I don't know whether governments are going to understand that, because, like I said, I don't fight with the structures. I mean, Mr. Panchu, he's obviously in India. He's like, I mean, for me, the mediator here. He's also giving up on this, on those institutions and everything, because look, how much can you bang your head against a wall? So I decided a long time back, I'm not going to get into that. Let's create that world. I will, as soon as I can, because I said this symposium, let it get over. I'm finding ways to reach out right to communities, rural communities, urban communities, wherever, as soon as I can. Of course, Andrea helps damn good. She doesn't help, let's see. But we have to, as soon as we can, get out there. Why do I keep saying identifying those with the mediator mindset? Once those people are out there and they're identified by the communities, you'll have such a large pool of people who are giving people that user experience which is required. So you'll be able to connect to such a large pool. Beyond that, all this concept of certification and everything ultimately moves to user experience. Why are we doing this? Mock mediation, user experience. When user experience is already done, now skill development, that's what is required. Enough content is available. I've been saying that I'll create a structured skill development program for people to watch. They'll get the best from the best in the world. Today, we don't even know who's going out and giving that training. Who is that person? I mean, you just sit in one room and someone has gone and given some training, and at the end of it, you've certified them. What has been passed on?
Yeah, you see, I think an important part of, and for me, so I was trained as a mediator. Well, I did a master's in mediation and conflict resolution, right? Conflict intervention. But what was very special about, say, the training I got, it was done on a reflective practice type. So it was about figuring out, a lot of it was about reflective practice on yourself, who you were, what you felt, what you taught, and really that concept of understanding yourself before you try to understand somebody else. And that's the way so for me, it was really, and that's why I wrote a thesis on, was the personal transformation that I felt from learning about mediation, because that's what that training did. Well, it wasn't training, it was over 2 years. But that's what it did for me. So it allowed me to, I suppose, encompass everything that was mediation and who I was, and understand who I was. And by understanding who I was, because it was done on a reflective practice basis, by understanding who I was, when I go into the mediation room, I connect with those parts of myself when I see them in somebody else. So when I see those things, I connect and I go, oh yeah, actually, I know exactly what that is. I know what that feels. I know exactly. I can actually really connect with that person. And sometimes I could be sitting in the room and I'm connected to both people, which is what you should be doing. I'm connected with both people at the same time, and I can feel both their pains. And so people talk about, are you neutral? Are you multi-partial? I'm connected. So really, even when you're using the word multi-partial, it sounds like you're on this side and then you're on this side. Where for me, I'm connected to both of you through this process.
That's exactly what I'm saying. That is the person you are. Whatever of course, you're saying you went through whatever your masters and everything you did, you connected to what you were being told there, because the person you are, or that was the person that went into that training. You are that kind of person. So you found it useful. You could connect to what was being told because you had that mindset. I'm not saying that made you what you are today. You were this, but you connected with that, and whatever theory you did get could have only gone against what you were. That's the today, if you're talking about neutrality and all the like these aspects of impartiality or multi-partiality, whatever, these are just theory which is put into certain people, which actually sometimes confines them into a person which doesn't work for them. It doesn't work for the process. So I just feel that the person that you are connecting to people and able to do that, I don't think a training could do that. I don't think a training can do that. And if a training can do that, send this world into that training.
Wouldn't it be nice? Wouldn't it be nice, Vikram? Vikram, I have to go. I'm really sorry. I have to do a school collect. But thank you so much. It was such a lovely thing. And I know you were pushing me to have this conversation. And I was reluctant. And as I said at the start, I wasn't sure what that reluctance is. But because you kept that, I kind of was able to go back and look at it and figure out. So even if nobody else gets anything from this conversation, it actually set me on a little journey of discovery for myself. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And this, look, events are not complete without you. So you have to participate, and you bring in something special to them. So please, you have to participate. Don't think. I know you will bring in something. You will contribute to the discussion for sure. So thank you very much, Andrea.
Thanks, Vikram.
And I'll see you on the 30th. You're coming on the 30th?
I will be there. I have it in my diary booked in.
Perfect. See you then.